from traditional forms of architecture on-prem or in other clouds you may be familiar with. We'd also like to introduce you to the Azure Architecture Center and the frameworks, patterns, and practices that are contained within it. If you've had an opportunity to attend the Azure Operations and Governance Best Practices webinar prior to this, then that would be advantageous. But if you haven't, then please check that one out. That's also delivered by the Fast Track for Azure team, and there's some very good contained in it. Okay, let's have a look at what we're covering today. We've just covered the welcome and introductions. Very soon we'll hear from John Downs about the Azure Architecture Center and the patterns, practices, and frameworks contained within it. Then we will switch back to me, Daniel, and I'll talk about architecture in the cloud, the role of the architect in the modern cloud. We'll conduct an Azure architecture design session, and we'll also bring in some research from Relative Cost to Fix, which helps us to provide a business case for this important work, if that's what you need right now. Cloud Fundamentals is a session that will be delivered by John Downs. This is what every architect should know. They should have this in the back of their head when they are forming strategy and design. We'll cover cloud economics, cloud models, elasticity, and more patterns and practices of cloud computing. That's a very cool session. And last, we will get hands-on in the reliability pillar of the well-architected framework. We will review an architecture for high availability and disaster recovery. We'll talk about things like composite SLA, composite uptimes, RTO and RPO, and we'll also cover some resiliency patterns. We'll talk about runbooks and failure modes and all that good stuff. So that's going to be another really interesting session for the practical hands-on work of an architect or engineer. Finally, we'll wrap up with some final questions and a summary, and then we will conclude today's session. So without further ado, I will now hand over to John Downs, who is going to introduce you to the Azure Architecture Center. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. Today, I'd like to talk to you about some of the resources we've got available to help you be successful when you are designing and architecting solutions to run on Azure. So we're going to talk in a lot of detail about the Azure Architecture Center, as well as some of the other resources we've got available. And one of the things that Dan and I do all the time is refer back to the Architecture Center when we're working with customers, because there's so much useful information here and so many places that we can direct customers for more detailed information around topics we discuss. It's something that we really refer to and refer other people to every day. Now, the Architecture Center has a whole lot of material on it. So you can see here there's lots and lots of subsections and different pieces that are of relevance for all sorts of different scenarios. I'm going to just guide you through a few of the pieces that we use the most often. And the first of these is the Application Architecture Guide. If you're starting a journey into a new application on Azure, this is a good place to start. So it talks you through different styles of architecture. So for example, if you're considering a microservices architecture or maybe an N-tier application architecture, it explains what that architecture style means. It talks about some of the benefits of those, and then also the challenges and things to watch out for, and best practices if you are using this type of style. We also talk through some of the principles that we generally advocate when we're trying to design things on Azure. And we'll talk about some of these in more detail when we come back to some of the sections later in this talk. There's also some really useful information here about choosing different technologies, so weighing up different compute services and data stores and so forth to help make sense of the different options that Azure has available for each of these categories. And then we've also got some best practices that we've been able to distill from all of the different work we do with customers and where we see customers who are being very successful on Azure. We've tried to put those into a place where you can then understand how you might use those best practices yourself. And then there's some more specific material there around performance tuning, responsible innovation, and even if you're coming from another cloud, then you can look through the information that's specific to how Azure is similar to and different from those other providers. So the Application Architecture Guide is a really good resource to start with if you're designing an architecture for Azure. The next step you might often want to go to is to look at how somebody else has designed this in the past, what we call reference architectures. And you'll see that the Azure Architecture Center has a huge number of reference architectures as well. I haven't counted them, but I would guess that's hundreds. So on this page is reference architectures across a whole range of different categories. And if we just open up containers, for example, even within that one category, there's a whole bunch here. And we can open up one of these and just see what these reference architectures look like.